Okay, now I want to make this big jump, which is to the question of how do you think?
Me?
At all. How is thinking done?
By a little brain in your head.
Maybe the part that does it, but that isn't how.
If you happen to be wearing a white lab coat or have an office with a nice couch, we could have a very long talk about how my father, scientist, anthropologist, psychologist, cyberneticist, has affected my approach to life. But that may or may not be interesting. So I'd like to look at the question from another angle. I have his forehead and his long legs, and in keeping with the genetic similarities I inherited from him, I'm inviting you to do the thing he did best, which is to look at the thing, be it an earthworm, a number sequence, a tree, a formal definition of addiction, anything at all, from another angle. The thing was never the thing. The map was not the territory. And whatever it was could be turned slightly and re-examined, seemingly infinitely. Like a Rubik's Cube, only one in which there might be several right answers and patterns. He would twist one bit and re-evaluate the rules from there, and then twist it again to be sure he didn't get stuck down a singular line of thinking. This is a film about how Gregory Bateson thought. He was always learning from everyone and everything around him, from the dog, from the fish tank, from the scientists who came to visit, from poetry, from artwork, from me. And as a child, I learned from him that learning never stops.
It is more than fashionable. It is inculcated by our great universities, who believe there is such a thing as psychology, which is different from sociology, and such a thing as anthropology, which is different from both, and such a thing as aesthetics or art criticism, which is different from both, all three, all four, whatever, and that the world is made of separable items of knowledge in which, if you were a student, you could be examined by a series of disconnected questions called true or false quizzes, quiz bits, as you might say. And the first point I want to get over to you is that the world is not like that at all, or let us be more polite. The world in which I live is not like that at all. And as to you, it's your business to live in whatever world you want to.
Gregory Bateson challenged us to rethink or to stand back and try to perceive in a different way, to see how reality is actually operating. How does biology work? How do we work? How does even our own thinking get determined by larger ideas?
When finally one of his ideas went ka-thunk and fell into place, and the waves, like the whale flapping its tail, were enormous and just echoed out into all these different disciplines. So his inspirational quality was really quite extraordinary.
That he worked in so many disciplines is a consequence of his way of thinking. He was not interested in specializing in a narrow field. He was interested in larger patterns. He was interested in how things are connected, and especially how living things are connected.
From biology at the beginning, into anthropology, into systems of ideas, pathologies of systems of ideas, and then to systems of ideas which are how we all try to live together. And we all includes the animals and the plants as well as you and me.
Looking at just how reality unfolds and how it all works. And when you take a little piece of it, then you just look at that little piece and you come up with a lot of erroneous interpretations of what's going on.
I've always thought that way.
Yeah.
That the relation between me and that book, or the book on the table, is still a microcosm of the relation between man and God, or God and the devil, or what have you. That the big relations and the small relations are all the same thing. For study purposes, you have to work with small ones sometimes. And then people blame you for working with small ones. Then you start working with big ones, and they blame you for being a mystic.
No, but
But it's all the same business.
It was as though he could zoom in on the very intimate and personal dynamics of a single conversation and zoom out and be able to hold in focus a much larger context. As a child, I used to sit on the floor next to him, drawing pictures and listening while he gave lectures. Even then, it seemed to me that he was peering through a trap door at the inner workings of life. Krishnamurti said something like, "You might think you're thinking your own thoughts. You're not. You're thinking your culture's thoughts." And Gregory said, "The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think." What does it even mean to change the way we think?
I guess I've been reading too much Alice. You remember when they come out from swimming in Alice's tears, she and all the animals? She tries to dry them by reading them history, which she thinks is the driest material she can produce. And she reaches the sentence, "The Archbishop found it advisable." The duck said, "Found what advisable?" "It," said Alice. "It, to me," said the duck, "is usually a frog or a worm."
Gregory observed, as all of us have by now, that human beings frequently behave in ways that are destructive of natural ecological systems. And he asked the question, what is there about our way of perceiving that makes us not see the delicate interdependencies in an ecological system that give it its integrity? We don't see them, and therefore we break them.
The story basically was in the late 19th century. Some busy entomologist, as Gregory said, was up looking around in the very high beams over the High Hall at New College, Oxford, and noticed that something needed to be done. And then it was a big question of where would you find oak timbers 40 feet long and 2 feet by 2 feet anywhere in modern England. And then it turned out that at some place in the college lands there were some very large oak trees that it was reported. There was a forester who came and said, "We was wondering what you'd be asking. We've been keeping those trees for the oak beams of New College, Oxford, because beams do wear out after a few hundred years, and we wanted to have some new ones on hand." And Gregory said, "That's the way to run a culture."
What is important is how he approached everything. How does it work? What works with it? What are its relationships? How does it interact? How does it learn? And of course, how does it think? Poring through his work, I find that I'm continually reminded at each step that an ecology of mind is a slippery and rigorous friend. Without context, words and actions have no meaning at all. This is true of all communication, that which tells the sea anemone how to grow and the amoeba what he should do next.
You have probably been taught that you have 5 fingers. That is, on the whole, incorrect. That is the way language subdivides things into things. Probably the biological truth is that in the growth of this thing in your embryology, which you scarcely remember, what was important was not 5, but 4 relations between pairs of fingers.
We're always in relation to something, and that being in relation was a real critical aspect of Gregory's thought. Well, one of my favorite examples is actually to pick a molecule in the body, because it's very simple. It's not a complicated thing like a thought. Something like the blood molecule hemoglobin. We could know everything about the atoms that make up hemoglobin, even where they came from in the formation of the universe. We could know the structure of it. We could know its interaction with all kinds of other substances in the world. To know everything we could about the physics and chemistry and history of the hemoglobin in terms of where the atoms and molecules came from, we would still not know the essential thing. We would not know that it's in relationship to oxygen and in relationship to the way oxygen helps bodies process energy. It's in that kind of funny sense about oxygen and about life and about metabolism, getting energy. What's surprising about it is that probably we could go to another planet in the galaxy somewhere where we found life like animal life that used oxygen because it's such a wonderful source of energy. It's such a powerfully bonding atom. And they would probably have something like hemoglobin flowing through their veins. But it would be nothing like hemoglobin in any of its details. Probably not even a protein that we would recognize. But it would do the same thing. The function of hemoglobin is what we're talking about when we say that. And the function of hemoglobin is not what it is, but it's what it's in relationship to.
You live in a world that's only made of relationships. When you think you can talk about the table, you say it's hard. All you are saying is that in a conflict, a confrontation between table and your hand had to stop moving at a certain point. The table won. If the table was soft, your hand would have won. But you're talking about something between the two of them.
I once spent hundreds of hours looking at a film of a family therapy session. And there was a mother and a father and the child who was the identified patient and a psychotherapist. And that child was a bizarre behavior, disruptive, just. And I thought, oh, that child is making his parents miserable. What an awful thing. And then after I'd watched it another 100 times, I thought, you know, it's that mother that's making the child behave that way. Another 100 times, and I thought, now father's sitting there, you think he's not doing anything. He's the one that's causing all the trouble. And then eventually I thought, you know, I think it might be the psychotherapist. The point being that the pathology was not in the child or the mother or the father or the therapist. It was in the system. It was in the pattern of relationship between them. And I was trying to attach it to an individual, which is the way we are trained to think about causation.
What happens
is that when you breach a holistic structure and you say, or do it without saying it, but you say, I am only going to attend to this end of the relationship. I am going to study the role of the doctor, R-O-L-E. Now, a role is a half-assed relationship, you know. It's one end of a relationship. And you cannot study one end of a relationship and make any sense. What you will make is disaster.
His father, William Bateson, was a biologist and a geneticist. And in fact, William Bateson coined the term genetics. He was a formidable intellect and was, as Gregory put it, ready for the ideas of the 20th century in the 1800s. He read Blake and Shakespeare to his boys at the breakfast table and sought through his plants and his studies for the genius of nature. You might be surprised to learn that the heavy doses of science that the Batesons took on were inspired by the arts. They saw the arts as extensions of the masterpiece that nature is.
He studied life wherever he could, whether it was the play of dolphins or the dance ceremonies of a Balinese tribe or the growth of a shell or a crab, whether it was the behavior of an alcoholic or a schizophrenic. All those were fields that tremendously interested him because they are various manifestations of life that he studied.
This was in 1924, I was in Galapagos, and failed almost completely to find out what a zoologist would do in the field. I was clear I didn't want to live in a lab. I was clear that I didn't know what field zoology meant, and nobody else did. I looked around, and in a year and a half, I was on my way to New Guinea as an anthropologist. There was no training you could give there. There wasn't any anthropology you could train anybody in.
It was in New Guinea that Gregory met renowned anthropologist Margaret Mead.
We began to get an idea. We was then me and Margaret Mead, we were married. We began to get an idea of, I suppose, the affective systems, the emotional systems of a culture. What's now, I think, called value systems.
Well, it was pioneering work in several ways. During that field trip to Bali and New Guinea, Gregory was the one taking the photographs. And he took photographs and he took movies. And always in the past, for instance, when Margaret went to Samoa, she took a Brownie box camera and she probably took 50 photographs. When Margaret and Gregory went to the field, they really wanted to document behavior in a brand new way. Gregory took 50,000 photographs.
During World War II, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, engaged Gregory to use his knowledge of patterns and culture to manipulate intercepted messages and disrupt communication within the Axis powers. They used his abilities in ways which were antithetical to everything he'd worked toward, and it broke his heart. It was not until after the war that Gregory was revived by the remarkable events of the Macy conferences, where a whole new kind of conversation between scientists and artists took place, and cybernetics was born.
He is one of the founders of this whole school of systems thinking, together with Norbert Wiener and Margaret Mead and John von Neumann and a lot of other scientists.
It was sort of delightful because it was a sense of a bunch of personalities who had a new tool in common, and they were coming from all sorts of disciplines. And that was one of the great attractions. This is one of the few cases where interdisciplinary approach really, really was real and really paid off.
How could you imagine them even being in the same room having a conversation? I think probably a lot of arguments. What came of that group was the trunk of the tree that became computers and the internet and everything else.
Cybernetics was a science developed to describe processes taking place in complex systems, interactions, organization, communication, control. What's happening? How are the different parts of a system connecting to each other?
And it's partly the realization that you have a system, and when you poke it here instead of something happening there, it happens that way, or in a barely recognizable dimension. And that's because it's a very complex system, which has feedbacks and all these things in it. But the complexity is going to continually baffle you until you just really engage. And what you engage with is cybernetic understanding.
Gregory's thought process can take a moment to become accustomed to. Your eyes have to adjust to the alignment he maintained, in which the context of the natural world is pulled outward, so that its inhabitants, including creatures, oceans, forests, and urban infrastructures, are like musicians in a jazz group, improvising together.
I've been bothered a little bit the last few days by people who say, what do you mean, ecology of mind? And approximately what I mean is that the various sorts of stuff that goes on in one's heads and in one's behavior and dealing with other people and walking up and down mountains and getting sick and getting well and all that, that all that stuff interlocks and, in fact, constitutes a network, and you've got the sort of complicated, living, partly struggling, partly cooperating tangle that you'd find on the side of any of these mountains with the trees and various plants and animals that live there. In fact, an ecology.
Ideas are adjusting to each other, to stimuli from the outside, and infinite other messages. Gregory's concept of mind was that it's much more than the brain in your head. It's the tree root that grows around a rock, or the way river otters play.
The notion that an animal really should be thought of as a tangle of ideas which have to live together in him, more or less. An evolutionary principle which is then the evolution of ideas, not the evolution of animals, where the units of evolution are essentially ideas, where anatomy is a body of ideas, with bilateral symmetry, the two sides of a body is an idea on which other ideas have to be built. For example, that the horse and the tundra, the grassy plains, are interlocked. It's an evolution in which now the grass needs the horse as much as the horse needs the grass. And if you want grass, if you want what's called a lawn, in the suburbs, you will first of all go and buy a mower, which will be the teeth of the horse, cut that grass, you will then go and you will buy a roller, and the roller crushes the grass down and makes it make turf. And finally, you will end up going and buying a sack of manure, because you have to be at least the other half of the horse too, you see.
He hoped to leave a big framework into which the specialists could place their findings to be examined within the context of the mass tangle of interrelationships that each tree, each person, each system in our world embodies. Context was the key. If I'm right, the whole of our thinking about what we are and what other people are has to be restructured.
Epistemology, this million-dollar word, most people treat it as how we know what we know, the study of how knowledge comes to be, how it's produced in our brains, how we acquire it, what kind of a thing it is. And it's probably best understood as in contrast to how things just are. Knowledge about things is not a thing. And I think Gregory was quite clear about that.
He naturally asked himself, what is it to know? How do we know? And so he got into epistemology, and he saw it as part of natural science, part of biology or natural history. He didn't see it as an abstract philosophical field.
I would like you to assume that that's been drawn more carefully, that these angles are what they should be, and those are what they should be. And I want you to think for a moment how you will describe that to some other person. First of all, there is a small minority who say it looks like a boot. These are the analogic picture thinkers, you see. But of course there isn't any boot, and to describe the boot which it looks like would be as laborious as to say it looks like a boot. Then there are the people who break it into parts. And they will say, well, it's a hexagon, but it isn't a hexagon, and a rectangle, which isn't a rectangle. And by describing what it nearly is but isn't quite, they get a sort of description out. And the division, of course, into parts is purely arbitrary. They could have sliced it any way they wanted, and you see, it would be interesting if they had sliced it like that. But inconvenient. And the point I'm getting at, you see, is that the division of things into parts tends to be a device of convenience. And that's all.
Gregory liked to quote Blake in saying, "Wise men see outlines, and therefore they draw them." And when he takes the chalk and draws the line across what I see as a boot, he illustrates for us the arbitrariness of the kind of separations that are created by defining things. So that when we define something as separate from something else, we create limits to our ability to see the interrelationships and the dynamics of those interrelationships. So that is why Gregory also liked to quote Blake in saying, "Madmen see outlines, and therefore they draw them."
And then there are the people who are the real scientists, and they see, I didn't draw this one very well, but there is an imaginary line, and which, if it were drawn properly, defines various, limits These are scientists. You see, they look for a relation which isn't really there, in terms of which they will describe this thing. All right, now, you see, what's reality? These people are not in disagreement about the figure. Nobody ever mentions, of course, that it's a figure done in chalk on a blackboard. That it's made of this funny white stuff. I've never had one mention that. Indeed, I think only a psychotic would do that. You know, they're the ones who say the ink blot looks like a blot of ink. This is very sick. On the whole, we can get a certain amount of agreement, you know, about what's really there, but we cannot get agreement about ways of describing it, and we use in the description a whole mass of concepts of intervening variables and mentionables to get our stuff across.
We have been trained to think in ways we hardly notice. Religion, education, and culture all filter and frame our perception.
If I'm of the belief, for instance, that that there really is some object, there really is objectivity to the fullest extent, and that actually would mean that that coffee cup on the table is being rendered identically in your head as mine. And we know now, even with fMRIs, that is just not the case. And for us to believe it's really the same thing, and for us to argue, is pointless. It's absolutely pointless. The way you make sense of that coffee cup and the way I make sense of that coffee cup, different. But it's still a coffee cup. And I think that we'd have a little more peaceful earth, really, if we had that perspective, that I would respect the fact that you have a different sense-making of that coffee cup than mine. In fact, I would want to learn about it. And we do that through conversation.
He often used the difference that makes a difference. The difference that makes a difference is a way in which to define something in terms of its relationships, using contrast and context instead of isolating it with a name.
The difference between this and this is not, of course, in this. It's not in that. It's not in the space between them. I can't pinch it. And where is it? And the difference in this and this, you know, is not moved when I move this one.
If the world is made of relationships, how can we describe one thing from another? And that was a question that Gregory was focusing on, and why he used the difference that makes a difference as a way of describing contrast and creating a process of defining the relationships between things.
It's a tool that leads us to look for things in a different way. Instead of looking at the substance of it, looking at the parts and saying, what made this part, what made that part, and where did the design plan come from that makes those parts work together? One sees in the pattern of their similarities and differences a whole separate kind of patterning process. And I think that was characteristic of his way of looking through the surface to some deeper dimension.
Gregory Basin's ideas in article after article in different areas are giving clues to how to take the elevator up one flight and get on a meta level where you get enormous leverage in your understanding. Mathematics is one method, and other social patterns are another. And just the ability to recognize the same pattern when you see it in two different contexts.
Even the language we speak pushes our minds into particular ways of identifying and defining our world. Adjusting our lens in order to see what might be holding systems together is a radical step toward threading the world back together from the inside.
The question of what the ideas are that govern how we think about the world, that those ideas again become linked up with how we live in the world, what sort of damage we do to it, what sort of pollution, exploitation, etc., we engage in.
On the other side, through that double-twisted, what we called a double bind some years ago, there's another stage of wisdom. Gregory and his colleagues coined the term double bind. The double bind describes a pattern that's like a catch-22, an experience in which there seems to be no solution for escape. The story Gregory used sometimes to explain the double bind was about the gnat in Through the Looking Glass.
And the gnat is a still small voice explaining the insects of Through the Looking Glass land to Alice. We don't have butterflies, we have bread and butterflies. And the bread and butterfly has wings of very thin slices of bread and butter and a head made of lump of sugar. Alice says, what does it live on? The gnat says, weak tea with cream in it. Alice saw a difficulty. So she said, what happens if it can't find any? The gnat says, it dies. Alice says, that must happen rather often. The gnat says, it always happens. The double bind in which the bread and butterfly finds himself, namely that if he gets his food, his head dissolves in it. Therefore, his only hope of survival is not to find any food, but then he starves. And this is, you see, a formal double bind of the simplest kind.
I was told that ulcers were things that you got when you worried. So immediately, I was kind of a weird guy as a kid. I thought, oh my God, what the heck will I do if I start to worry about ulcers?
We are in a double bind in the sense that we have growing inequality, and the answer by the political leadership is to grow the economy faster. But as we grow the economy faster, it seems to exacerbate the inequality, and it's also having tremendous impacts on global climate and on the environment itself. So the answer is more, and yet clearly there needs to be some qualitative shift. And in order to see that it's time for a qualitative shift, it would take extraordinary vision and imagination, because slowing the economy creates immediate unemployment, pain, suffering, and political backlash.
The double bind is a creative imperative. It's the moment when, because this doesn't work and that doesn't work, something else is going to have to be improvised. A creative impulse is necessary at that moment to get out of the situation, to take it up a level. Can we see a bigger picture? Can we think about the way that we think? Can we see the problems of linear thinking in a world made up of circles? Einstein said, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." My dad asked, what pattern connects the crab to the lobster and the orchid to the primrose, and all the four of them to me, and me to you.
He often talked about this, and he never answered it. It became sort of the big Bateson puzzle. Now, if you look at those things he mentions, the crab, the lobster, the orchid, the primrose, and two human beings, what do they have in common? Obviously, they're living organisms, they're living beings. What is the pattern of organization that is common to all living beings?
You might say looking beyond the surface and looking for the principles behind something. That becomes, I think, the general description of much of what he does when he looks at nature. He recognizes that by looking at the patterns, at the regularities in nature, the redundancies, the similarities of things, but recognizing that it's always theme with variation. The combination of theme and variation immediately points you to something behind it, a formative principle.
He was often accused of talking in riddles and never coming to the point. The question he posed, what is the pattern that connects, was never meant to be answered, because the patterns are changing. It was the act of questioning that he was pushing for, knowing that the eyes behind that curiosity will be the most apt to give the patterns of connection room to wiggle as they perpetually self-correct, and to see the beauty in that process.
When you see process, you see constant change. So that's why Gregory was constantly quoting Heraclitus. You know, Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said, "No man can step into the same river twice because it's flowing." And by the same token, maybe you can't kiss the same person twice. You can't pick up the same baby twice.
A man walking is never in balance, but always correcting for imbalance. Growing up in California, I learned that in an earthquake, the kind of structures that last are the ones that have enough flexibility to allow for the ground to shift. That was the same sort of architecture that Gregory tried to develop in his students' thinking skills. Those moments of being able to say, I used to think it was like this, but I'm starting to think it might be like this. That was a way of saying, I learned something. So there wasn't any sort of concrete value placed on the stability of an opinion. In fact, it was just the opposite.
It's like an acrobat. He's walking on a high wire, and he's got a balancing stick. Now, whenever he feels himself fall over that way, he does this with his balancing stick, pushing this side down, raising this side, and thereby gets a little bit of torsion in his own body to balance himself, to not go over that side. If he overdoes it, he'll have to do the reverse to not go over that side, and he may, wobble. He may, as they say, oscillate, like any other self-corrective system, a machine with a governor, what have you. But what he's essentially doing is using the changeability of his relationship to the balancing pole to preserve a basic proposition, I am on the high wire.
Change may be scary, but not changing is even scarier. Our ability to remain stable is ironically a measure of our flexibility. Not allowing change is the perfect formula for becoming obsolete.
The world in which you've been placed is rather a strange world, because it doesn't contain anything. It only contains news, reports of difference, reports of change, preferences for change, preferences for stability, etc., etc., etc. But you know, really no high wire, no balancing pole, only states of a balancing pole, states of you on a high wire. From the moment when I saw that the word stable refers not to the cat, not to me, not to the object, when I say it is stable, the moment I discovered that it was an error, I was living in a world of ideas. Very important ideas, very elegant ideas. To live in a world of ideas is to be alive. So here we are, floating in a world which consists of nothing but change, because if there isn't any change, there isn't any knowledge that there isn't. Only by the creation of change can I perceive something. And in this world we float, we talk, and we talk as if, you know, there were a static element in the world.
Change is happening with or without our noticing it. We live on a ball, swirling with systems within systems that are interacting all the time. Any attempt to lock down elements of that process is an abstraction and causes imbalance, like the tightrope walker if he were to tie down a limb. The pathology of wrong thinking in which we all live can only in the end be corrected by an enormous discovery of those relationships which make up the beauty of nature.
We talked about Goethe's thing about the leaf and the stem and the bud, and how a stem is defined by having leaves which have stems in its angles, and so on. Now that stuff, for me, is really very right-brainish sort of stuff. And if I go for a walk in the woods, stuff like that is what I enjoy as I walk along.
Any kind of aesthetic response is a response to relationships. When you read a poem, the rhythm is the relationship between the words. The different vowels echo each other. The images match up in various ways with images in your own head. So the experience that you take from the reading of a poem or looking at a painting is an unconscious exploration of the many different relationships that the artist has managed to capture.
One of the things that I think is most amazing about being a human being is that we can get inside of each other's heads, that we can share stories, that we can live parts of each other's lives vicariously. And if you've been in a society for any period of time in which you're in communication with people, you are really entwined in a web so deeply with other people's stories that it seems to me it should be very hard to be able to tell ourselves apart from that.
The story is of the man who asked his computer, do you compute that you will ever think like a human being? And the computer worked on the question and finally it printed the answer. And the piece of paper had on it printed, quote, "That reminds me of a story," unquote.
Gregory, of course, was very much interested in how the kind of relationships develop and structure human personalities and societies. The reverse of that, however, we find in torture, in humiliation, in oppression. Its link to ugliness is straightforward also. It's destroying relationship. It's using relationship to undermine other relationships. That's ugly.
One of the interesting things that happens is if you look at your hand and consider it not as a number of bananas on the end of a sort of a flexible stick, but as a nest of relations, you will find that the object looks much prettier than you thought it looked. Now, this means that with a correction of our epistemology, you might find the world was a great deal more beautiful than you thought it was. Not only that, but you wouldn't be able to collect things. The whole problem of possession begins to look totally different. It's easy to collect multiples of bananas. You can stack them in various ways and so on, count them, tell your neighbors how many you've got, and so on. But to say relations, I don't know how many relations go to make this rather elegant object here. And relations between relations, and relations between relations between relations.
Expression through the arts was considered by Gregory to be the most honest and pure form of human communication. It's easy to forget that when we find meaning in a story or enjoy the beauty of a piece of music, we're engaging in the realm of thinking that is most in sync with nature. Metaphor is the language of relationships, the language of natural systems, in which there's room to communicate in spectrums of possibility instead of tightly defined cul-de-sacs.
He thought from such a very big place. His mind was big, but then his heart was as big as his mind. So, you put those two together. That's what was so exciting about living with Gregory.
I'm endlessly fighting a battle with people, who want to throw the intellect out and think of nothing but the heart. And when you fight that battle, then you sound like an intellectual. Yeah. But when I meet intellectuals, I find myself fighting the opposite battle.
The perception of separation, of me from you, of us from the redwoods, of the redwoods from the African deserts, is an illusion. I wonder, what is the opposite of the pattern which connects? Aren't the lines we draw, the splitting and the dividing, imaginary anyway? T.S. Eliot said, "A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well."
Over here there's humanity and everything it does, and then over here is the other living stuff and climate and things like that. And the idea of those being conceptually separate, operationally separate, theoretically separate, scientifically separate is just nuts. It just asks for some of the kinds of problems we've got.
To believe that there is such a division, and the belief in such a division does affect our conduct in all sorts of ways. It affects our entire ethical system. It affects our whole notion of what is healthy, what is sick, what is a crime, the whole McNaughton rule and all that stuff, all hinges around what I believe to be a nonsense dichotomy, and one which the sooner we get all the way away from, so that we don't have it lurking around in our vocabulary or anywhere else, the happier and sooner we shall be happy, or a little happier.
Blake said, "If a fool should persist in his folly, he would become wise. Are we there yet? What's on the other side of the garden door is total obsolescence and freedom, and maybe another sort of democracy. It's Christian, it's Buddhist, Muslim, pagan, it's Jewish and radical and conservative. It's totally punk rock. It's authentic, and it questions authority, questions it till it bleeds with the authenticity of the unseparated. What are the premises that we want to maintain? What are fundamental and essential parts of our ways of living, of our lives, of our perception, that we wish to keep intact and that we are willing to use our thresholds of flexibility to maintain? What are we willing to adjust, and what do we want to keep as essential?
The nature of the world in which I live and in which I wish you lived, all of you, and all the time. But even I don't live in it all the time. There are times when I catch myself believing that there is such a thing as something which is separate from something else.
Gregory taught me that to be complete, really complete, incompletion must be included in the system. It's learning to learn. Anything else is just static, not evolving, finished. I eventually realized that even in death, relationships continue to grow. I'm still learning things from my father.
It's like climbing a mountain, Nora. You've got trails going up it, where people have gone before, right? And if you want to get up higher than they went, you go up their trails, and then you push on a little bit further than they were ever able to get.
That's what I was trying to say.
I said it first.
Well, I thought it first.
All right. I hope that may have given you some entertainment, something to think about, and I hope it may have done something to set you free from thinking in material and logical terms when you are, in fact, trying to think about living things.